Red Cave Podcast. Reading tonight from Tales from the Cracks, numbers 37 through 39. Starting with Key or Quandry, followed by Renfield and the Count, and concluded with Darkness Bends Back. Unmindful of the roses, unmindful of the thorn, a reaper tired reposes among his gathered corn. So might I till the morn, cold as the cold Decembers, past as the days that set, while only one remembers, and all the rest forget. But one remembers yet. Christina Rossetti. Key or Quandry. In bed he breathed loudly under his sleeper's spell, a rhythm a little less than normal. It would seem that he would take 2 breaths for every inhale, throat shedding and nose honking with some clogged snore. Bed sheets rose up and down with every snore, a dark hulk under the mounds of his blankets and pillows, seemingly alive and growling like a cornered animal. His thoughts were sporadic in his muffled dream space, all motion and no form, of complex mathematical operations, numbers floating in space, accompanied by the low hums of human speech, speaking without tongues. He dreamed about lists and charts, days, months, and entire years of his life categorized on some ledger out there, where he could at least hint at some order amidst the chaos. His routine at falling asleep had worked as well as a well-tuned clock, easing him down into the throes of suspended animation. It was always the same. He would lie down on his back and picture his body as a great ball of yarn, slowly being unraveled to reveal the meaty center of his being. That was always his goal, to find what lay at the heart of his ball of yarn, but he always fell asleep before he could reach it. How many licks? 1, 2, 3, crack! The ball vaporized completely, taking him and his name into nothingness. Utopia, he said aloud in his sleep. Between the snores and sputters, his thoughts picked up where he left off. Utopia, translated to mean nowhere, his voice said within the dream. He found himself in a space cluttered and uncomfortable, like a cafeteria full of people. People scuffled and laughed, all voices melding into one great Buddhist incantation. Can't even hear myself think, he yelled aloud, but no one listened. The noise ground against the inside of his ears, gears spinning gears. From somewhere behind the cacophony he could hear someone snoring, obnoxiously so. In his dream, the student fell into a memory. The coin is a way to ground yourself during the moments when you are feeling self-destructive, let's call it, the professor said. Yes, but unnecessary, I think. Isn't the point to embrace these tendencies without stifling them? The student asked. In a word, yes, but there is a certain amount of discipline that must be learned first before practicing this. Discipline? That's another word for a cage, exactly what you said we would be free from. After the end of this apprenticeship, after you learn the process of discrimination, you can't act on any fancy you want. That is a fine practice, but there are darker impulses no man should want to act on that crop up in the mind. But to stand on a cliff, it is human nature to think suddenly about jumping off in the self-destructive dark fantasy of pain. But we wouldn't act on that, would we? But the true practitioner is he who jumps at his master's voice. It isn't why, but how high. The student woke up in the dead of night and wiped off the new sweat on his brow. He could have sworn he heard something, but outside his window. He paused for a moment to listen intently to his surroundings. After a few minutes, he decided it was all in the dream and got up to use the restroom. When he came back, his window was open and the curtains were blowing wildly in the breeze. He knelt by the window cautiously and peeked out a bit, his hands grabbing for the baseball bat from the corner. He only saw the roof, but something had to have opened it, or maybe he did, or... He decided to check on the roof, so he stepped onto his windowsill. He carefully trudged over the shingles until he reached the topmost part of the roof. He looked around once or twice, the bat raised, and decided he had left his window open. Maybe someone was in his room right now, waiting for him to give up and come back. He wasn't going to go back in there right away, so he went to the edge of the roof and then went in through his front door. Creeping through his hallway, he stopped dead in his tracks because something was in the room with him. He could feel it. He turned from his bedroom door that he was just about to open. The room was dark since he had just shut off the light. He desperately felt for the switch and fumbled with it. The light streamed through the bulb up ahead, and whatever he'd sensed wasn't there anymore. He chuckled and remembered what he had been doing. Then he heard shuffling behind him near his bed. There was a scratching sound as if his bed was being lifted from the ground. The student was just swinging open the door as he turned back around to see the bed fall back into place in the shadows. A shape of no real form seemed to skitter across the dusty floor and blend in with the shadows to his right. The student squealed a bit in fear, and the light was flipped back on. No one. Nothing was there. Had that just been his imagination? his bed lifting up as if something was coming up from under it. He took one last look around before he turned off the light and stepped into the hall. And that's when he noticed the object sitting on his kitchen table. He knew precisely what it was before he approached the table, and he knew instinctually to open up the cupboard to his right and retrieve his flashlight. He began shining the flashlight through the box full of tangled cobwebs and pieces of string. A red light projected out from the other side and against the wall, so he knew there had to be a tinted tissue paper on the inside, strung up on the other end. He pictured the hide of an animal pulled taut over a drum. He should have reached into the box, but he was too afraid that the strands of web would slice through him like cheese knives. This wasn't here for show or for education. It was a trick. It was his own homemade projector. Maybe it was here for show after all. He placed the box on the kitchen table and set the flashlight in front of the mouth. He looked at the opposite wall, where an image was now blown up, tinted red, of course. The cobwebs and pieces of string were carefully arranged in such a way that their shadows spelled out a very obvious message. What wasn't obvious was the meaning of the message and why it was being shown to him now. It had been 5,800 days since his last meeting with the checkered striped tie, what the student liked to call the masked meet and greets. That's how he felt whenever he attended one of those meetings. There was always a new person to meet, and the mask must be constructed. Always handcrafted, always hand-painted. Checkered pattern, of course. It is the ultimate bond of nature, and mankind, and man with woman, and God and man. That is not to say that the group was religious. Anyway, the student knew that he was done with the checkered striped tie, and he hadn't spoken to his mentor in all of that time. So what could this message mean, projected on his wall like an overhead slide? None of these words meant anything to him, especially when grouped in this particular sentence. There was always an underlying code. Key or quandary is the lingo they use during a meeting amongst friends. Black checkered tie or checkered striped tie is the lingo they use outside, amid the people. They all know the sayings by heart. Key or quandary are the buildings they operate in. Both are tucked away in remote places in the wilderness. One is on the tail end of a dirt road in the mountains. It is very easy to overlook the mansion in the tropical wilderness, with all the ivy and moss that cling to it like parasites. These are the two possible places for their next meeting. Members know other members, so if they want to speak about the next meeting, they better use the code questions, or they will be punished. Yes is code for key, no is code for quandary. So are they spinning tonight, or are they collecting? Most of the members liked collecting. All the student knew was that this message they'd left for him wasn't code, at least not when he was a member. You see, you're either a member or you're not. Some people get chosen and some get discarded, like the student. He was lucky. Most of the discarded get killed because they can't be trusted. The student always assumed that his mentor had liked him. So what was stopping him from visiting Key and Quandary and staking out one of the meetings unseen? Non-members must shut themselves up in their houses. The former members know what is going on, and they know why they should stay in for the night. People who don't know about the checkered tie know that people get killed on the 5th of every month, just after nightfall. Most people stay in all day. They've seen pictures of the limbless bodies mutilated and naked, or they might have even lost a family member to whatever monster lurks in the jungle. If you're chosen to be a member, you are finally told the mystery involving the 5th of every month. You are subject to leave or to be fired from checkered tie at any meeting. You either take the secret of the jungle to yourself, or you are terminated. Of course, there have been a few leaks in the past, but it's nothing the leader can't handle. Sometimes he's had to kill off hundreds of men and women to keep the secret of the checkered tie. But it took the student a few moments to realize that the message on the wall were coordinates. When he plugged the coordinates into his computer, he saw that the fabled jungle of Key and Quandary had finally been disclosed to him. He knew that he was being called to do one last thing, and since the 5th of the month was coming, he better follow through, or else become the sacrifice. He wasn't sure if he would be spinning or collecting. He supposed he'd have to find out at the provided coordinates. The next day, at the site of the National Park Forest, provided to him by the coordinates of his phone, he couldn't believe what he was seeing, and then he had to suppress a laugh. He was also wearing a mask of black and white checkered patterns, as required by the group, and his finely pressed suit jacket and slacks weren't doing him any favors in the humid heat. He had to look professional. This was his job, after all. He was being called back to the checkered ties for one last initiation. He thought he had been left out. He thought he had been dismissed. No, he was a new man. He was supposed to do something, and he was so sure now that it was to collect. All he knew was he had to help this man presented before him in the forest. Somehow he was important to the world. This semi-conscious man in the middle of the woods was supposed to live. A freak occurrence had sent him out here, bloody and disoriented. He wasn't meant to be here. That much the student could be sure of. He was not supposed to die out in the middle of nowhere. He still had a purpose. And when the world throws a curveball of fate and chance at a person, there has to be someone to fix it. The student guessed that was his job. He was the one who was supposed to step in when nothing else did. He was supposed to give people a second chance when they were dealt a shitty hand. He knew that if he ignored his newfound duties, death would be after him again, and he'd have to answer to the checkered ties, as it was the 5th of the month. And he didn't want to be spun. Thus, he would have to collect. His first collection was a man by the name of Stanley White, and it looked like he had been gored by an animal, possibly one with antlers. That had been his curveball. He was lying on his side on a dirt trail, arms crossed behind his back. His eyes were closed and he was moaning. If it hadn't been for the moaning, the student would have suspected that he was already dead. He looked awful. His tattered, dusty clothes were stained with blood, his skin red and peeling. Somewhere he'd come across a thorn plant, as pins lined his pant legs. The student stepped over a large bush and came up from behind him. His broken wrists were handcuffed, and he had to question whether he had been attacked by an animal at all. Maybe the checkered ties had attacked him, disemboweled him, handcuffed him, and left him for him to find. The student didn't know why this man was important. When he bent down next to him and placed a hand on his side, he didn't see anything of significance in his upturned face. The way his eyes opened in slivers and his dry lips pulled back in an ugly sneer, the student felt a pang of disgust for the man. Why did he deserve to be saved? He wondered if the world would really turn out for the worst if he let Stanley White die. He wondered what could really happen. Would he be the sacrifice for the 5th of the month? Or would the student become the sacrifice for neglecting his duties? He pictured wars, people dead in the street, and mushroom clouds on the horizon, just as his mentor had always prophesied. Was that an over-exaggeration, or did the world's balance really depend on this man's survival? It wasn't the student's job to really understand this. He had to collect, or he would be spun. But he had to ask the same question about himself. He too was important, so he couldn't be that different from this man, wallowing in the weeds and dust. "Mr. White, I'm here to help you," the student said. "Huh? What?" He stood up and became lost in his thoughts. He knew he was supposed to help Stanley White, but he didn't know how. He rewound back to his lessons from his mentor, and to the dream he had had the night before, and he realized he was left with a decision. He didn't have many options, not out there in the middle of the woods. He had to hurry because this man was fading fast. He couldn't even hold his head up anymore. All he could do was lie there like a lifeless doll and moan in his anguish. His handcuffs were to be the first priority. The student knelt down again and intertwined his fingers around the man's wrists. His hands were so cold, even in the heat. The student looked at his own bare wrists and concentrated. He had done something like this before under the tutelage of his mentor. It had all been preparation for this. His mentor had gifted him with the coin, which was now clasped in his palm, pressed against the man's handcuff bracelet. It was all for this. Nothing up his sleeve, nothing in his hands. Keep your eye on the cuffs. Are you looking? Now, you'll just say the magic words. There was a progression of backward chords emanating out of the woods, which stood alone but bled out into one long transgression, blending styles of repeated folk torch songs, that sticky singing, words gumming in the throat and teasing the tongue, repetition. What better than a mantra to cling to in all this noise, all this blend, where only one instrument can be understood at a time, a mantra to light the darkness, to fill the thoughts. Self-sufficient beatbox, the instrument is the mouth. It can fill the harmonica with wind and yet break apart the beat. Slurred speech, purposeful acceleration for effect, and then the pace slows and the instrument takes the place of another. As the student stood up, the sky became white, and he could swear that there had never been any such thing as a cloud, not in this world. If there was, then it was the largest cloud he'd ever seen, like the breath of the earth on a cold day, and it was cold too. Cold enough to freeze the air in front of them both, cold enough to harden the lungs and sting the eyes. Stanley White appeared to be frozen in place. The trees were more still than usual. If that was even possible, it was too cold, even for the trees. The student's every intention became to wriggle out from under the heavy blanket of perspiration. Helping Stanley to his feet, they kept their eyes to the dirt path, as gray as the weather, as cold as their cheeks. They hurried on to their next destination, Stanley White gripping his exposed intestines with both hands, and the student kept his own arm laced across his back, pulling and prodding him forward and struggling under the weight of the man who could only limp along, hyperventilating, his face masked by his own perspirated breath. They hurried away from the oppressive cloud above their heads and the chanting music coming from the forest behind them. The students' feet were as reliable as an autopilot. They were stranded in this new place that neither of them quite understood. This wasn't the woods that the student had first entered. Stanley White mentioned something underneath his breath about being on a hiking trip to the summit to the peak, but somewhere along the way he had lost track of the paths. Then he described the monster that had found him and dragged him out of the woods and back onto the path, not before sampling his insides. The sun was finally abandoning them. After an hour of getting even more lost, following this never-ending trail that seemed to circle around in a corkscrew pattern down the hill, they decided to settle down under an umbrella-like pine. They rested, listening to the drumming and chanting of the background, which had only diminished in volume a minuscule amount since their hour-long hike had begun. They both clutched each other close, and Stanley White cursed himself for losing his way out there in the middle of nowhere. That's when the student looked up and noticed a hooded man standing alone, face hidden, hands tucked in the sleeves of his robes. He just stood there in the now pelting rain, stiff and unmoving. The student called out to him, discarding his mask and waving his arms, calling the name of the checkered ties, and using the code word, key or quandry. Stanley White looked at him, and then out into the pelting rain. But judging by his crossed eyebrows, it was not clear if he discerned what the student was seeing. But the hooded man did not move or acknowledge the student or Stanley White in the slightest. The student told Stanley White to stay where he was and sprinted toward the mysterious figure. He put his head down low from the cold rain and looked back up just in time to see that the hooded figure was gone, leaving 2 footprints, bare feet, in the fresh mud to prove that someone had been standing there. He looked back at the protective pine, but saw that Stanley White was also absent. Then he heard the man scream from far off in the distance, and he sprinted toward it, sobbing with frantic emotion. He ran through the rain, but never heard the scream again. But still, he fled for hours on end, searching for the man that he had saved. And when he came to the cliff, he almost slipped off the edge as the wet gravel slipped under his digging heels. The chanting and drumming noises had been replaced by the pounding, reverberating moan of the beast, gaining in volume behind him. And he heard his mentor's words in his ear, those faded words, asking him, "It is human nature to think suddenly without jumping off that cliff in the destructive dark fantasy of pain, but we wouldn't act on that, would we?" Gripping the magic coin in his hand, gifted to him by his mentor, he asked himself, "Why not?" and jumped into the free space, trading his life for Stanley's, hoping that the coin would deliver him before the sharp rocks at the bottom tasted his insides, as the beast had tasted Stanley White's guts. No longer the collector, through the air, he spun. Renfield and the Count. Excerpted from the diaries of Paul Blatty, collected by permission from the Lakeshore County authorities on August 17th, 2020. 3/15/2012. I've become absolutely fascinated with Tom. These last few months of my high school year, I have taken it upon myself to better understand him. I found that during lunch I strike up individual conversations with Tom as my other friends sit stupidly with their hands in their laps. We talk about music and girls and most of all, death. Tom has studied many different philosophical writers, such as Plato and Immanuel Kant, and transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. He also speaks highly of John Locke, and once argued that a human soul has a mind of its own. For someone who has such a negative outlook on life, Tom is well read with the works that express the exact opposite. He keeps his mind open while keeping it closed. Though we talk a lot about the possibility of a god and the specialities of life, we do not discuss Tom's ambition to become a serial killer. Apparently, I am the only one he has entrusted with his dark secret. I feel honored and a little excited to keep such information. Tom still scares me on a small scale, but I also respect him on a much grander scale. In truth, Tom has said what I have only thought about in my darkest of moments. No matter how much I refuse to accept Tom's theory, I have thought of killing another human being, but these thoughts are passed off as juvenile inquiries, deemed too sinful for coherent contemplation. I'm scared to admit this to Tom. I still remember the day my grandmother passed. I remember watching the life run out of her, and how I retained my tears as though in short supply. Sure, I could have cried, but I was too consumed with the show that was unfolding before me. While my family had hurried out of the room, I had stayed to stare into my grandmother's death mask. I remember looking past her slack jaw into a dark rabbit hole, half expecting to stare heaven in its golden eye. Part of me believes that by watching my grandma die, I've come closer to understanding the mystery of life. By that logic, it appears completely plausible that the more death I experience, the more godlike I will become. I know Tom feels the same way. Tom wants to be God as well, but somewhere he has gotten lost along the way. While I perceive my encounter with death as an assurance of an afterlife, Tom has taken his encounter at the funeral home as proof for tragedy. Whatever he saw there was enough to convince him that life was cruel. Why would a god allow something as despicable as a funeral home to exist, where the dead are showcased for the living and dressed up like life-size dolls? We are exact opposites. We should rub each other the wrong way, but I like to think of our friendship as a magnet, composed of polar opposites, sure to strike a bond. I want to know everything about him. The first question I asked him this morning was if he'd ever killed before. He was leaning up against the lockers at school, waiting for the next period to begin. This is what he said. Never another person, but I've killed a ton of animals. When I was a kid, I used to dissect them. I tried to act as a surgeon at a mortuary, extracting the insides, stuffing them with sawdust and hay, before sewing them up. They never kept. I asked him who he absolutely hated. Who would be the first on his list? I don't have a list, he said. It's useless to hold grudges. No one can hurt me. I decided that a long time ago. Then how would he decide who to kill? He laughed. I'll play it by ear, he said. I suppose I'll just choose at random, when my urges are too overwhelming for me to control. Then he told me that he channeled his aggression by killing animals in the lakeshore woods, usually rabbits and squirrels. I want to go with him the next time he goes hunting, but I am too ashamed to ask. I'm afraid that Tom will laugh and blow me off, and most of all, I am afraid of what it could lead to. I want to be like Tom in some respect, but I certainly don't want to formulate into a serial killer, the worst breed of monster on this earth. I don't want to be evil, yet I remember what it feels like to witness the miracle. I just want more of that. I don't know how to go about proposing my interest in Tom's extracurricular activities. It is like turning myself inside out and asking, how do I look? Tom can do it. He is at peace with his dark side. Here, in my last year of high school, my monster's full potential is not yet realized, and what little of a picture I have in my mind is too ugly and blurry to make out, like a face inside a dream. Still, Tom smiles as he discusses murder. 6/05/2019. The pen and needle killer. It kind of rolls off the tongue. In Texas, a body was found last Thursday with all its blood drained. I've included the newspaper clipping here inside this journal. How like a doll the victim must have looked. It's all like a trip back to high school, and I'm inside a tight room with ceremonial death masks lining the walls, with their tongues hanging out and their eyes bugging. And here is a life-size doll set out like some kind of heirloom from another life, from a long-forgotten trip. There are needles in the flesh, which serve as reminders for where the blood flows. Tom isn't far from all this. He was never far from me or my thoughts. The son of a bitch is in Texas, working at some funeral home in Austin as an embalmer. I looked him up this morning after finally putting down the paper. Absolutely glorious. His news is reaching me here in Colorado, in his old hometown. I turned on the television, and it turns out his news is national. The reporters can't necessarily understand why this murder is so rocking, so out of this world. But I know what the fascination is. It's so fucked up that everyone needs to hear about it. It's just that simple. The pen and needle killer. I can't get over it. Yes, I knew it was Tom from the moment the paper mentioned punctured arteries and knitting needles. There isn't a doubt in my mind. Along with this new assurance, there's also something strange coming over me. I'm shaking even as I write these words. It's as if a leash is pulling me, but in all sorts of directions, back and forth and side to side. I can't explain why, but I keep picturing Tom in my mind as I once knew him. He's holding the leash. I want to follow. Well, at least Tom grew into his clothes, so to speak. He became exactly what he had dreamed, no matter how sick it was. I wanted to be a poet, writing pieces for literary magazines or books, but here I am, substituting for ill high school teachers 3 times a week. Thank God I have my campground. If that was to leave me too, I would have nothing to stop me from moving down to Austin, to do God knows what. I'm scared of what these feelings could amount to. I need to get back up there into the park. I just bought a new chainsaw with a wider body and a nose like a marlin. Yet I can't stop thinking of Tom and how he was able to get out, to escape. I feel bitter that he never called me once since high school graduation to catch up and swap the shit. I'm angry that he did all this without consulting me. I know his secret. I know who he is, and I could make things very bad for him. He must know that I'm out there somewhere in the world, reading about the pin and needle killer, and he must know that I would be able to put two and two together. Does that make me privileged, or does that make me his enemy? I've never lived a charmed life, that's for damn sure. 8/12/2019. I haven't been up to the campground at all this month. It's beautiful weather, but I can't seem to get out of this town. There's one thing that's keeping me grounded here, and it's the daily newspaper. A second body was found in Austin, this one an old woman, laid out in the middle of a dirt road. They say she was there for a day at the most. It was indeed the work of the pin and needle killer. There were the familiar stab wounds and some new accessories. Apparently the words, "Go tell it on the mountain," were spelled out on her chest with an arrangement of different colored thumbtacks. The psycho. What was he trying to say? The authorities can't find any connections between the two crimes besides the knitting needles and the lack of blood. The first victim had been a young man in his 20s, a legal partner for some law firm. The woman had just been some woman, ripped off her front porch and found some 200 miles away. There had been an obvious scuffle on the porch. Some broken glass from a cup, a lone broom found on the lawn. The pin and needle killer had swept the dust before making off with the woman. To cover up his tracks, I guess. This led the cops to believe that he had subdued the woman with a chemical, like chloroform, so that he could go back to the house and clean up without fear of her drawing a ton of attention. They really have no idea. No one saw the getaway car. There were no prints on the broom handle or on any of the items in and around the house. Whatever this guy is, he was smart enough to wear his gloves, at least. That's what the evening news keeps telling me. Yet they also assure me that he's going to slip up. He will slip up. I can't help but laugh. What, are they trying to scare Tom? Good luck to them. But he is a man without motives. There's nothing they can take from him or give him. 10/23/2019. I wanted to listen, but I thought that would be pushing my luck. I went back to the car and moved it so that I was even further from the house. I saw Tom leave with the girl in his arms. She was wrapped in bed sheets, and he unloaded her into the back of his truck. I followed him back to his apartment and waited some more. Tom was in there with the body, doing God knows what. I must have fallen asleep, and when I woke up, Tom's truck was gone. I had missed it. It was there in the morning, and he had gone somewhere to dispose of the body. I decided that I could do nothing more, so I went home and crashed. At least, I tried to sleep, but there was too much to think about. I woke up this afternoon to turn on the news. Tom did not disappoint. The girl was found on a school playground with the same pins stuck in all the same places, but this time Tom had embalmed her. There had been a second laceration on the other side of her neck where he had inserted the tube. I can't believe this. How idiotic can he be? It will only be a matter of time before cops enter every funeral home in Texas, questioning every owner and director. Tom will be one of these suspects. It is almost like he's egging the authorities on, purposefully leaving his own set of clues. Why would he do something so bold and downright stupid? Why did he come back to Lakeshore? This town is much too small for him to hide. None of this makes sense. Yet, Tom always did work on his own accord, by his own means. He's a lot smarter than the authorities, or even I, give him the credit for. All I know is that Tom is not comfortable anymore. His little thrill ride is over, either because he wants it over, or because he got careless. This next murder has changed me as well. It's shown me that I should strive to break out of my own comfort zone. All my life I've lived in the same town, accepting the usual routine and the second-rate job. I want to join Tom on the lam. I have to finish what I've started. The Count. It was only 2 blocks away, and Tom made it to the hotel in 10 minutes. He passed by the service desk where a tired old man was watching a mini television set. He did not look up. Tom fumbled with his key, and before escaping into his room, he looked around the parking lot. He looked at his watch, 7:45. He would stay up for a few more hours until 10 or 11. Then he would have to call it a night. He wanted to get an early start in the morning and hopefully take the train downtown. There he would commandeer another vehicle and get on the highway. He needed to leave Colorado, even though that brought him great sadness. He would have to take many more lives to assure his own safety. Tom entered room 312 and stretched out on his bed. He set his knife and wallet neatly atop his nightstand. He turned on the TV, but couldn't keep his eyes open. At 9 p.m., a knock came at his door. In a daze, he asked who it was. There was no answer. He undid the chain and poked his head out. Paul came out from around the corner, his handgun upraised. Tom froze. Paul smiled and waved for him to come out of the room. "Paul?" he asked. "Come on, we're going to take a ride," Paul said. "How'd you find me? What did you do?" "There'll be plenty of time for questions," Paul replied. "Now get into the car before I change my fucking mind." Renfield and the Count. Paul instructed Tom to leave the path. Tom was freezing. He barely had any feeling in his hands, but he continued to move them up and down his arms. He looked at Paul with puzzlement. "Leave the path? And go where?" he asked with chattering teeth. Paul pointed his flashlight at the first marker just outside the trail. By now there was a small footpath visible from all of Paul's recent activity. Tom reluctantly stepped off the trail. "I'm just saying, you're a lot more human than you think. You're just a little confused." "Don't talk to me," Paul snapped. "You want to be a monster. You want it more than anything, but you don't know how. You think that if you kill me, you can put something to rest. Once I kill you, everything is going to be set right. You'll see, or maybe you won't. I'm the one that's going to see. You can't get over me, can you, Paul? There's too much going on in your little head. And you think by taking my life, you'll be able to finally think straight. You want to be me. You want to be the pen and needle killer. That angers you, doesn't it? It angers you that I can kill without any hesitation and you can't. You've always been that way. You can't honestly believe that by killing me, you'll become me, do you? You changed my life. Ever since I first met you, I never felt like myself. You robbed me of my innocence in my childhood. You made me into something ugly," Paul said. "Don't give me that. You always had it in you," Tom answered. "You were fucked up even before I met you. I don't know what you saw or what you did, but you were always sick. You just had a fine way of hiding it. You can't hide it anymore, can you, Paul? My whole life I've been torn. I just want to be whole again. You will always be that piece of me that won't fit, no matter how many different ways I try to rearrange you. The best thing I can do is throw you away. Then I can be whole again, or at least as whole as I'm ever going to be." "We're so alike, Paul Blatty. You just can't see it. I complete you, and that scares the hell out of you. You're a miserable joke. You refuse to accept that which makes you normal. Anything that makes you human is evil. That's why I'm sure you could never keep a relationship. You will never be happy because you're too content with your dark side. It's one big act. You've always liked being the strange one because it gives you an excuse to be dark. I could have taught you so much more. I don't want to do anything with you." Tom didn't say anything. He just kept walking. Tears were starting to fill Paul's eyes. "No matter how much you prepare yourself, Paul, you can't pull that trigger. You can't. You will never be able to kill me. Just like I will never be able to kill you. It's time for you to drop that gun and let us go on our way. Hell, you can follow me, and we can start over. You're not a monster." "I am a monster," Paul said. "No, these feelings don't make you inhuman. Granted, you don't have any self-control, but you're still okay. I have control because I have no moral quandaries. You, on the other hand, have moral limits. You want to kill, but you also know it's wrong. You are trapped within a paradox you can't break. Life means nothing to me, so I can be the cold monster. You need to realize that you are who you are. Forget about me and forget about the pin and needle killer. You can't be either." "We shall see, Tom," Paul replied. "We're getting close." Tom stepped into the clearing and looked around dumbly. Tom walked a few steps closer. "What did I do to make you want to kill me?" Paul laughed. "You're one to talk, pin and needle killer. What did that old woman do to you in Texas? Did she give you an ugly look?" Paul was dancing comically in the high grass, his teeth flashing. Tom finally turned to face Paul, and he wore absolutely no expression. "I shall have to invent a new classification for him and call him Zoophagus, life-eating maniac. What he desires is to absorb as many lives as he can, and he has lain himself out to achieve it in an accumulative way," Tom rehearsed. He glared into Paul's flashlight. "Are you familiar with Mr. Renfield?" "What?" Paul asked. "From a book," Tom replied. "He was the mental patient that ate flies, because he believed it was the same as ingesting life. He thought that he was becoming stronger. Surely if he were out there in the world, he would have been dangerous, but inside his padded cell, he was only a danger to himself." "Stop stalling," Paul said. He admired the Count. He wanted to become his faithful servant. He would frequently break out of the hospital to meet with the Count, but he was only a proxy. The Count only humored his interests so that he could infiltrate the hospital and seek out the woman of his desire. Renfield was insane, but he realized what was happening to him. He knew that the Count was more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. He tried to speak with the doctors to warn them, but one night the Count entered through Renfield's window and stopped his heart. "The Count? Is that what he is to you, Tom? Is he dangerous, unfeeling, and unstoppable? The Count is nothing but a coward. He gave into hiding in the end. He fled the country after Van Helsing and his men swore the revenge. He died a coward. I have tried to keep an open mind, and it is not the ordinary things of life that could close it, but the strange things, the extraordinary things, the things that make one doubt if they are mad or sane," Tom said. His eyes were closed, and his hands were still folded. "Are these your last words?" Paul asked. "Is that it?" Tom reopened his eyes and started to advance on Paul. "Don't come any closer. Do you hear me? Get back!" Tom was walking even faster, his heavy arms swinging. Paul fired the gun, but prematurely. The bullet whizzed past Tom's shoulder and the second shot went into the ground. Paul screamed as Tom punched him in the stomach. The third bullet buried itself into Tom's shoe, barely missing his big toe. He threw Paul against one of the stumps and his skull bounced. He fired again, and this time the gun was aimed at the sky. Tom grabbed Paul's wrist and wrestled the weapon away from his sweaty fingers. The fifth bullet was a misfire, and the gun went hot. Paul squealed and nursed his blistered fingers. Tom dropped the pistol into the grass, attending to his own hand. He kicked Paul hard in the crotch. Paul fell over onto his side, weeping uncontrollably. His hands were busy tearing at the grass and raking into the soft dirt underneath. "I am!" Paul screamed. "I am!" Tom kicked him again. "I don't know what you are, Paul," he said. "I've been wrong in the past. When it comes to you, there is no classification." Tom gathered the pistol and cocked it for good measure. He aimed it at Paul's forehead. Paul looked up, but not at Tom or at the gun's barrel. He was looking at something over Tom's shoulder, and whatever it was, it caused him to stop crying. His mouth dropped open and his eyes grew to the size of coasters. Tom turned his head momentarily, yet there was nothing to catch his attention. There was only an empty clearing. He glanced back at Paul and frowned. Paul was smiling now. Somehow he was a child again, and Tom no longer existed. Tom turned around a second time, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. "Paul, can you hear me?" Paul was giggling. Spittle ran freely down his chin. Across the clearing, in Paul's mind's eye, a tree was burning. Brilliant flames of orange and red consumed the trunk in a healthy silhouette against the dark background. The fire met at a fine point near the canopy, spitting plumes of black smoke into the air. All the tree's limbs were bent up, as if to reach for the moon with blackened fingertips. Wood was popping and cracking, while bright embers, that resembled fireflies, rained down on the clearing and died before ever touching the earth. Somewhere near the middle, there was a tremendous crack, and the tree was in two pieces. Paul could hear the tree scream as it fell inward. The fan of fire embraced him like a warm washcloth against his forehead, and he knew that it was finally time to get some sleep. Tom shot him twice in the temple, before jamming the pistol into his pants. He found himself lost more than once, and it was only a matter of backtracking to the last marker. He regretted not taking Paul's flashlight with him. In the darkness, he was becoming more and more disoriented. His stomach was beginning to bubble, and his depth perception was doing him little good. Twice he stopped to vomit, but it wasn't from the cold or dark. It was from the image of Paul giggling through a mouthful of spit, and how quickly that smile of his had dropped once dead. Tom stumbled out of the woods and leaned upon a boulder for support. The trail was rolling out below him like a red carpet, and he gratefully followed. He didn't even realize that he was running. Darkness bends back. He found he was casually nodding off to sleep. He sat up in his seat and ran his greasy fingers over his burning eyes. It had been a long day of work. His clothes and hair stank with the fumes of embalming fluid. No matter how much he reassured himself he was used to the smell, he could never get past that sting in his nostrils, as if his short hairs were smoldering. At the same time, he loved the smell. It brought him back to another place, forgotten in his own personal timeline. He rubbed his meaty hands together, watching the veins stand out in perfect road maps. He reminisced on the many times those hands had gone to work. All the countless projects represented a different vein beneath his flesh. He counted all the ones marking his right hand and nodded. 4 discernible projects, but there were so many more. But the world only knew of 4. Beneath the surface was a graveyard. He heard a footfall behind him and turned around in his bench. The train station was completely empty, save for him and one other. A dirty man with a mop of gray hair and a beard to match approached Tom, clutching a duffel bag to his chest like a life vest. The train station was open to the night, so the man's breath clouded his features in a mask of fog. He wore no coat, so he shook violently. He looked out beyond his mane to mark Tom hungrily with sad eyes. Tom followed him with his own gaze, waiting impatiently for the man's intentions. He had an idea. He knew the man wasn't going to ask for directions. He had nowhere to go. Tom, on the other hand, did have somewhere to go. It was 11 o'clock at night, and he just wanted to go home. "Pardon me, pal, but do you have 85 cents you can spare?" the dirty man asked. He stopped inches from the back of Tom's bench. Thin, gnarled fingers crept over the cooled steel, barely grasping Tom's jacket sleeve. "First of all, take a step back," Tom snorted, recoiling from the man's fingers as though they were a team of serpents. The man processed this and nodded his shaggy head. He retreated a few steps. "Now," Tom began from his seat, "you need 85 cents. For what?" "The next train," the man responded. "I don't think that's true," Tom said. "You've decided to settle here for the night." The man took a look around him. "I can't stay here," he almost seemed to snap. "There's no bed. It's all concrete, and I don't even have a coat." "Then where are you staying? In the park up the hill, or in the parking garage?" "I'm going home. I need to catch the next train, just like you." "No, you're not like me," Tom said, gaining his feet. Are you going to give me change or not? Negative. I am not giving you a thing, Tom countered, shoving his hands into his pockets. In the breeze, Tom's shoulder-length hair veiled his face, accentuating the curve of his nose and lips in a ghostly death mask, hollow eye sockets filled with shadow. Tom refused to say another word. He only stared out at the man in a quiet contempt. The light in the nearby archway flickered, died, and sparked again. I'll gladly accept anything you have to spare, the man said, this time with a noticeable waver. Tom hadn't moved an inch. He remained rooted into the platform, blinking in and out of the night with each flicker from the light bulb. But like a restless creature, his hair curled to the side. I don't have anything to spare. Well, thanks anyway. The man turned and proceeded towards the exit of the platform, rather hurriedly. He stole a glance back at Tom, but he was exactly how he was, hands in his pockets, hair whipping. When he was at the verge of crossing under the archway, Tom called after him. I thought you were trying to catch this train, the voice cried from the other end of the station. The man turned, but refused to stop altogether. He continued to back up blindly. Well, I don't have enough money, do I? Just dodge on without the ticket. They never check this time of night. I'll feel better if I had the man's heel caught against a raise in the sidewalk, and he went pinwheeling back onto his back, duffel bag disappearing into the mouth of a bush. He scrambled into a crawling position and glanced back across the platform. Tom was standing in the same spot. He couldn't make out the face beyond that tangle of hair, but he was sure it wasn't one of concern. You okay? Tom asked. Fine, just knocked the wind out of me, the man murmured. What? Just stay where you are. Tom didn't say a thing. He continued to watch the dirty man with a quiet fascination. The man kept Tom in his peripherals as he went rooting through the shrubs. He came out with his duffel bag and beat the dust from its stitching. Listen, I lied. I have some spare change, Tom yelled. One hand pulled out of his pocket, up to reveal a collection of coins. It was too far away to make out the amount from across the way, but the man could see that the light reflected off of something. How much you got? The man pressed. Come see for yourself. Tell me how much it is first. What, are you afraid to come closer? You did it before. Come on, Tom insisted. The man edged closer before pausing. He still wasn't close enough to make out what was in Tom's hand. He edged closer still, trembling, but not just from the chill. A few steps more, he was sure that Tom was offering what looked like quarters. Here, Tom said. The man snatched them hastily and retreated, a respectable distance to study his gift. You said you had 98 cents. That plus 43 gives you more than enough for a ticket. Go ahead. The ticket machine is right there, Tom explained, pointing off to his left. I need 85. There's a round-trip ticket I have to buy for tomorrow morning. Not at this hour. There are no round-trip tickets for the morning. Then I need to get a student ticket for my grandson. I left him over in the park. We're going together. You're alone, and you'd have to be a pretty poor grandfather to leave your grandson alone in a park at midnight. Try another. Listen, I don't have to explain myself to you. Do you have the rest or don't you? The man barked. There goes that temper again. You should really watch it. If I'm going to give you money, I have the right to know what it's for. You lost the right to reserve your business when you approached me, begging for spare change. Now, if you don't want to accept what little I gave you, I'll need a better explanation. So far, you haven't told me the truth. I have the rest of the 85 cents and another dollar to follow that. If you can tell me the truth, I'll give it all to you. It's for the train. I know that if I give you the rest, you'll run off, so don't stick with that. I'm presenting you with an opportunity to make up for all your misguided answers. Tell me the truth and I'll give this to you. Tom revealed his other hand and unclenched the fist. There was a crumpled dollar and a variety of pennies, nickels, and dimes. The truth now. The dirty old man hesitated, glaring at the change as if to make sure it wouldn't crawl away if he happened to blink or look away. The truth. Tom nodded. For once, the hair covering his face parted. Tom was grinning. The man sprang at Tom, the duffel bag swinging. It caught Tom in the chest as the man grabbed at the cash. Tom managed to drop the change and cling to the man's wrist. The change went spinning and bouncing over the edge of the platform, clinking against the railroad tracks. The man screamed just before the knife blade sliced through the center of his Adam's apple. The duffel bag hit the ground first, then the dirty man joined it, choking on his own blood. Tom wiped the knife blade clean with the man's pant leg before returning it to its holster. Tom stood over the man and watched him die. The dollar bill skated across the concrete before clutching in the homeless man's bushy hair. Tom bent down to retrieve it and tucked it inside the man's pocket. He took a seat on the bench and continued to study the lines on his hands. You're getting a little sloppy, aren't you? Tom whirled around, the knife upraised and ready. When he realized who had spoken, he started to laugh. He put away the knife and relaxed back into his seat. Paul Baker, Rise View High, class of 2008. How the hell are you? Tom said. Paul rounded the bench to face Tom. He was pointing a gun at Tom's heart. You shouldn't be laughing, Tom. I just saw everything. If I can't pin you for the first 4 deaths in Arlen, then I can pin you for this one. No, Paul, if you couldn't pin me for those deaths in Arlen, you absolutely can't pin me for this. What are you talking about? Of course I can. How's that? Where are your cop friends? You didn't think you'd have to trail me tonight, did you? You knew police were following you. Of course, Paul. I knew you were following me as well. I just thought you'd go home for the night, which is all I'm trying to do. You're wrong, Tom. There are squad cars just over the hill. They're waiting for my signal. All I have to do is call out the right word, and they'll come running down. Give me a little more credit than that, Paul. If there were truly cops up over the hill, they'd be here by now, and they would never allow you to come waltzing down here with a loaded gun, alone. No matter how much you want to be, it doesn't make it so. It's just me and you. They're waiting for my signal. Here, I have these. Paul tossed a pair of handcuffs at Tom. He turned them over in his hand. Come off it, Paul. It's just you and me. You don't want to take me into the police station with blood on my hands. You want to escort me into your car and drop me off somewhere secluded. Then you'll kill me. Not here in the open. We need to go into the woods. Isn't that right, Paul? That's where you do your dirty work. Shut up. Put the cuffs on and let's go. Tom laughed, folding his arms. If you're going to kill me, Paul, do it here and now. Look. I did it. It's easy. Just pull the trigger and you're free to run. Nothing ties you here to this crime scene. It's so easy. You're wrong. It's not that easy. You may think it is, but you're too blind for your own good. Life has a lot more value than you let on. No, it doesn't. That's why I'm not defending myself right now. I'm not trying to stop you, but on the other hand, I don't think you can kill me. You can't find the strength. Even if we were in your secluded refuge in the woods, I don't think you could do it. We're like brothers, Paul, you and me. This time Paul laughed. I hate you. Then pull the trigger. I'm not playing. Put the cuffs on, now! Tom stuffed the handcuffs into his pocket. Well, I love you, Paul. You and I are one and the same. I am nothing like you. Of course not, Paul. I am. Paul's booming voice was drowned out by the oncoming roar of the train. The platform shook and the bench rattled. The night silence was overwhelmed by the juggernaut's shattering boom. Loose change scattered this way and that as the light went out. Tom and Paul were left in the succumbing darkness. Tom sitting casually on the uncomfortable bench, Paul forever pointing the nose of his pistol at Tom's heart. The horizon was blotted out as the train rolled past, segments of the moon flashing through the gaps in the cars, appearing as a silver streak coming and going. It only took a second for the screaming steel snake to pass beyond the reach of the boarding platform, and it never stopped. On its departure, only one man remained on the platform. He waited a minute, listening to the train's whistle fade off into the distance, and then stood up from the bench, brushing off his coat. He paid his respects at the platform for a moment, glancing down at the body on the tracks. He tossed the pistol in after the body, and strode away from the platform whistling. He would have to catch the train at another time, and in another place. Tune in next time for Tales from the Cracks, numbers 40 through 43. Until then, guard your soul.